perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Yeah. Unlike the government shutdowns, we will actually kind of give a how long out here. But you never know. Definite.
No, only if it's voluntary, Alex. Only you stay.
Yeah. We won't force you. We know you're locked in, but all right. So right now, everybody's coming in on YouTube, Facebook. They're all streaming now once they service out notifications. So we're just hanging out, talking a little bit. But those of you who are already here, we're
Dare
here.
I say it's a good dream?
It is a good time. Everybody's home. You better be watching. We're here with Alex Epstein, the famous of the more case fossil fuels and Center for Industrial Product things in helping people understand just how important it is to value and cherish human flourishing, and that if you forget how you got to be where, then those freedoms and mechanisms of how you actually be in. So
philosopher at his core. I've been a fan for a long time. So excited. But yeah.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Oh, it's gonna be great.
Oh, our pleasure.
So obviously, you know, we brought you on here to talk about on lately with all shut there. We just heard, of course, that now it's up to some 10 million people who filed for employment around the U.S., you know, state and federal, shutting down different industries. There's already people who are suffering, of course, getting furlough jobs. In, you know, many cases starting to come up against rent and realizing they're not going to be able to pay. And, you know, it's really important to remember that there are costs and consequences to if you're trying to stop a looming supposed, you know, plague of sorts, an infectious disease. So we want to kind of talk about those issues and bring to light the importance of thinking about the compared to what. So what would you say? My pleasure. What would you say, Alex, is, you know, kind of the forefront of your concerns when looking at the situation on the compared?
Can you guys hear me? Just making sure. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
I'm afraid like Netflix plus Pornhub is killing our stream right now.
Little lag. It's possible, but we can deal with it. We can hold it up.
Okay. So, I mean, I think everyone should be concerned that there's a virus, and I think particularly you should be concerned if you're, you know, if you think you're really at risk, and then you should also be concerned if people you love are at risk. And in general, there's reason to be concerned if the virus plus the current composition of the hospital system could lead certain places to be overwhelmed. Those are all very legitimate and important concerns. I guess my biggest area of concern, in part because I feel like nobody has paid attention to it, is that really the lives that tens or hundreds of millions of people have been building and their dreams are really being destroyed by the shutdown policies, and nobody seems to care. And one perspective I have on that I think differently about this than other people is I think of everything in terms of time. You hear about, well, it's lives and the economy, but ultimately, like, we only live so long and we only have so much time. And I think of it as just incredibly sad and tragic when somebody has built their life in a certain way and planning for the future because they want their time to be of a certain quality, and then that just gets totally wrecked. Like, that's a really tragic thing. And if it's necessary, which I don't think it is to anywhere near this extent, then that should be mourned. But instead, that's just thrown away as, oh, that's the economy. Don't you care about lives? And there's a lot more to say about that. But there's something very warped about not caring about the lives and dreams that people have built just being destroyed. And that's just written off as, oh, well, we have to save lives, because that's destroying lives in the sense of the quality of life, which I think is what we live for. I don't think we live just to keep our heart beating. We live to have a certain quality of life.
Right. Because otherwise you could just be in prison and in solitary. Then you would be fine with that. otherwise,
Yeah, solitary
But most
confinement is
people
somewhat
don't want
the
that in
ideal
actual.
policy right now.
Yeah, that's what they're pushing for, actually. Like, prisons in
Yeah,
our
that's what it should be
homes,
called,
really.
actually. They should just call it solitary confinement is the official government policy right now.
That'd be so much more honest than stay home, stay safe.
All
Ugh.
right, safer at home.
Oh,
It's Orwellian doublespeak.
no. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very what I've seen from the beginning for myself is that so often people lose sight of the fact that when large sectors of the economy, you're not just like, oh, it's
These
like
numbers here.
some
It's
like
not
businesses or stuff
6
like that.
million. It's
Right.
people, as you said really well, going for them or made plans. Some people just recovering from the recession back in '08. It's just crazy how all of a sudden now there's another major catastrophe and people feeling it are to government after another impeding them and their options.
Yeah, definitely. So that's kind of one level of it is just that, I like the term a lot, human flourishing, which refers to human beings living to their highest potential. And so one observation is just there's not really a human flourishing perspective on this. It's kind of like I don't know what it is, like it's almost like a human non-death thing or like a staving off death. It's just there's not a valuing of flourishing and quality of life. And then very related to that is there's no valuing of the precondition of human flourishing, which is human freedom. Because in order to live, like build a life and have dreams and live our dreams, we need to be free to judge what values to pursue and how to pursue them. And when you're basically forbidden from interacting with others, that destroys a lot of our productive ability and then a lot of our enjoyment ability in life. And that again is something where it's being done and it's being done cavalierly. It's not being done saying, oh, this is very temporary. It's necessary so that you can be free and flourish in the future. It's just like, no, your life doesn't matter at all. We need to prevent coronavirus deaths at all costs.
Ah, did you catch that end there?
Right. Oh, yeah. I think it blipped off just a little bit. Yeah. No. We heard what he said definitely, and we completely agree with the idea of human flourishing and how much that is often lost in the discourse, especially
I
when
actually
people
love
try
how you put it
to
that way. But
right.
yeah.
Especially when people try to come up with kind of static numbers about how people act when they're doing human modeling, and pandemics. They're not really thinking about individuals and how they might respond or adapt. They have a very fixed, flatten the curve mindset
Yes.
instead of expanding the capacity or raising the capacity.
A fixed mindset instead of a growth mindset and a recognition of human beings with the ability to reason. I liked how in your video, one of your recent ones or podcasts, was you're saying a lot of people are operating on the premises that humans are based on this mindless model, that humans are just like mindless, like they have no ability to reason or have free will or make choices or change or grow or innovate. They just see them as just needing to be coerced in order to be in line, because otherwise they just do crazy things like kill each other.
Yeah, and this is I think very related to the devaluing of flourishing and the devaluing of freedom, because the way human beings flourish is we choose and create and pursue values using our minds. And there's an emotional component to that, but ultimately we have to think. And then the primary reason for freedom is we need the freedom to think and to make those judgments and to create value. And if you regard human beings as mindless and self-destructive, or then you're not going to value freedom. And then you're going to assume that, well, freedom will lead to something bad. And there's just this contempt. You're seeing this shaming right now. Like anyone who chooses to pursue their own values right now with any amount of interaction with others is shamed. I mean, even like I got my haircut today. I really needed a haircut. and my barber slash stylist was telling me like she told clients she was available, and one of them
Oh,
said like,
good.
how dare you cut anyone's hair? Like, and she's being, responsible, and in my view, probably too sanitary. And I wore a mask when I was in there. But in my view, she's doing something very noble. She's creating value. She's pursuing her life. She's pursuing her dreams. And she's taking a lot of rational precautions. And that's the kind of judgment that individuals should be free to make and will generally make. And if you disagree with them, I think the general policy should be try to persuade them to do something differently. But individuals pursuing their lives, pursuing their dreams, creating value, interacting, these are all things that should be very sacred to us. And if there's ever, I think there is sometimes a reason for a kind of state of emergency. I think particularly if there's a war, like you're attacked, everyone's being attacked, then in a certain sense, freedom needs to be restricted temporarily, but it's in the name of protecting freedom. Just like you can say, well, okay, we can subpoena somebody, but that's in the name of a process that's supposed to protect freedom. But you don't take away people's freedom on the grounds of, oh, it's the government's job to save lives, because that just means it's choosing some lives and some time over others. So I think it can intervene when there's a threat to the freedom of all. But then there has to be very clear standards, which I'm not sure have been met in this case. And there needs to be very clear explanation of why. And there needs to be very clear timetable of what's going to happen. And unfortunately, we're not seeing any of that.
I see it from people like you. And so definitely some people advocate for freedom. And so that's great. But I definitely agree from the political sphere when it comes to like the CDC, the UN, like they certainly aren't caring about the lives that are going to be severely impacted by the shutdowns and the closing of things, the regulations they still have. So
Yeah, and
Right. It seems like as if those who are in state power, especially.
oh, go ahead.
oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, it's all good. Really quick. So it just seems like the incentive structure there for the people who are in power, right, is not to preserve human freedom in any case, but rather to seek and expand power. As you noted, that we don't even see any type of timeline or definitive end, because it seems as if any type of person being infected could be reason to keep restricting people's liberties. And I think that's kind of the perverse incentive of the nature of the state in this case, and in these types of situations especially, is to grow power for control, not to preserve freedom.
And to condition them too, people to accept the forced vaccinations, the shutdowns for their own safety,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it goes to what's the purpose of government and what's the purpose of force, of anyone using force. And I think it's to protect freedom. If you notice, there's kind of two moral perversions in this discussion. And so one perversion that I haven't talked about yet, but which is a big one, is that there's this idea of universal isolation as the solution, which means that everybody should be isolated to protect everybody, even though this is something that disproportionately affects the elderly and the immunocompromised. And so the logical thing is, if it disproportionately affects them and they will be the disproportionate burden on hospital capacity, which unfortunately is largely state controlled at this point, then the logical thing is just morally, most of the responsibility should be on them to protect themselves and to protect others. So insofar as isolation is necessary, whether it's a political or just a voluntary thing, that should fall on the people who are the most vulnerable and in a sense the most risky to the system. And yet there's this perversion where no, everybody is supposed to sacrifice equally, even though it doesn't make any sense. And even though you're locking people, you have these lockdowns and you're often locking down people who are vulnerable with younger people who may have it and pass it on, but aren't yet symptomatic. So it doesn't even make sense. Like, doesn't even make sense as far as any kind of quarantine logic goes. So there's that kind of perversion. But then there's also the collectivization perversion, I think, which is the idea, well, it's the government's job to decide whose life to save, which really means whose time is more valuable than somebody else's. And I don't see that as the purpose of the government at all. Again, I think it's to protect the rights and the freedom of all. So when you say something like, oh, well, is it worth the restaurant I built for 20 years, is that worth it for somebody to spend 3 more months in the ICU, and, die of the flu later instead of coronavirus now? Like, in a sense, you can say, yeah, it's kind of obvious that in a collective sense, if there was a sense, you'd say, yeah, it matters more to live 20 years of your life. You would choose to live 20 years of your life and take away 3 months at the end. But you can't really make those decisions for other people. It should be that, hey, you get to decide how to spend your life. And if you want to save your resources till the end to have what philosopher Leonard Peikoff once, I think, called a shopping spree in the ICU, like, go for it. So I just think the government, there's just this perversion where it's the government's job to say some people's time is more valuable than other people's time. And that's the meaning of this, like, oh, we're saving lives. It means we've decided your time doesn't matter. And I don't think the government should be doing that in the first place. And it certainly shouldn't be doing that at the expense of the young and healthy who haven't had as much opportunity to live their lives yet.
Yeah. Two things. One, are you an individualist by chance? Someone who went to the Ayn Rand Institute?
I worked there for 7 years,
And,
and I wrote there
I
for
forgot
even
my
longer
second.
than that. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely an individualist. I don't think you can be a humanist ultimately without being an individualist.
Yes, exactly. I'm with you. And I remember the second point is it's like government picking winners and losers. Government, just a group of some people picking some other humans to win, and usually they're going to pick their friends or whoever's going to pad their next campaign, or whatever, bribe them. And yeah, it's pretty insidious what's going on here. Is I really liked how you put it, the collectivization of human beings. For and individual action that's happening, because that's all it boils down to. A bunch of events like, oh, there was a mass genocide, but you could be very specific as to the very individual interactions that happened, which was governments, agents of the state, human beings with guns killed these people and shot them in the head. That's the very individual, real experience of what's actually going on that make up what the abstractions are. And all the sophists in politics and in the media use abstractions and language to cover up this reality, to cover up the individual, and to cover up the nature of violence that they are imposing on innocent, peaceful, otherwise peaceful, to our knowledge, human beings. So,
yeah, I mean, I assume have you guys read Atlas Shrugged before?
No, just lagging.
Oh. Uh-oh. I seem to have been cut off. You guys there? Uh-oh.
hey, Alex, you
Hey.
there?
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Can you guys hear me?
Hey, we're back. We're still live, it appears. Yeah,
Our
I think-
connection dropped.
yeah, it's not our actual internet. We have great internet speed, but the server side, because there's so many people at home, streaming and things like that, they did have some warnings about, streaming issues and things like that. So it's not surprising. We'll do our best, and hopefully, as long as it doesn't get too bad, each other say, we'll cut it. But otherwise, as long as people can otherwise hear us, we'll be good. So
Yeah, thanks for your patience.
yeah,
sorry about that.
But there's this
Sure. So what?
server side issue.
One thing I was saying, I had asked if you guys had read Atlas Shrugged before, and there's a line I love in Atlas Shrugged by one of the characters named Francisco de Anconia, and he's talking to a bunch of government officials who are ruining people's lives in the name of the common good, which really means just deciding that some people's lives and time should be sacrificed to others. And he says, I mean, something like, oh no.
Hey, Alex. Sorry, we're back. The connection dropped again. I think it was better, but you're in the middle of saying one of your favorite quotes from Ayn Rand, and there's a 10-second delay. So I'm going to stop talking and wait.
Okay. So it's from Atlas Shrugged, and it's one of the characters named Francisco de Anconia, and he's talking about these government officials who are sacrificing some individuals' lives and time for the sake of others in the name of the common good, which just means some people's lives and time count and some people don't. And he says something like, do you realize that the only thing that would be necessary to destroy this whole apparatus is for people to name the exact nature of what you're doing? And that's why I like to be very clear, and I appreciate you being very clear. It's like what it actually, when they say, oh, we're saving lives or the government is saving lives, what does that actually mean? It means you are stopping and destroying the lives of certain people, and you're not doing it to protect their freedom. You're not doing it in a way consistent with protecting their freedom. You are destroying lives. And
I love it. Same.
yeah.
Right. You must have a lag of 10 seconds or so too. So sorry to everybody. I'm glad you're coming in clear because you're the guest. And I'm glad that even though when we drop, you could still go. Someone in the chat said, you got it, Alex, keep going. So thanks for bearing. I love that quote. I did read the first parts of Ayn Rand, and then I watched a movie about it. So I more just watched the rest. So I didn't know of that quote.
Yeah, the movie,
but I really like
is,
it.
is
and
not good.
I actually
read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way she writes is so good. It's very good playwright and writer, Ayn Rand. Oh wow! I just have to say thank you to Tune In, Drop Out. That's his name. He says, "Keep this going. Always enjoy listening to Alex's point of view on current events." Me too. Okay, so you got another fan.
So does that mean
Awesome.
they gave
Well,
you
thank
money?
you so
Did they
much.
give you money?
Yeah, they just do like what's called a super chat.
Oh,
so someone
that's
just
awesome.
just to get attention, like to be able to be highlighted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So
Congratulations.
cool.
Yeah. Capitalism abounds everywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was a fan for you.
So yeah. So all right. So hopefully this is starting to
Sync
starting to sync up a little bit better.
I hope so.
But yeah. So let's keep talking here specifically about the ways that the state has actually impeded on human flourishing at this point, because now that we have a little bit more clarity as to some of the history and the events here, we know that the CCP, that is the Chinese government.
Okay, so
the
audience, if
communists.
now I understand. I think you can hear me. Oh, yeah. Okay, I didn't hear any of your question.
Okay, so talking about the history here that we actually know from what's been unraveled in terms of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're actually kind of covering up what had happened. We know that in many instances along this road, in terms of the pandemic spread, that governments have been a large part of the problem in terms of covering up what's actually taking place, and letting people know, that it was actually spreading in the first place, to, the FDA and CDC preventing testing in the early stages. There was a Dr. Chu who was doing a flu study, and she wanted to check samples that she had, and she couldn't because of the FDA and CDC. And then eventually let her test a little bit, and then she discovered there was, spread and things like that. And to me, it's just when you go through the chain of events and you realize how many different stumbling blocks there were for people to actually come up with market solutions along the way, that this should be a sign for people that there really needs to be a free market for people to respond, because otherwise you do get this flat, of the curve where you don't have innovation and you don't have people coming up with solutions. So could you speak to more?
Sure.
Capacity government keep everybody.
Yeah. So, there's an interesting view that I think is totally wrong, that the more important a value is, the more essential that the government make it a right. So you take education and medicine. Like those are two of the most fundamental things. It determines, the nurturing of your mind and the nurturing and curing of your body. And the idea is, well, those, of course, we need the government to control so that everyone has them, right? That's obvious. And one point I make about that is that for the government to make it a right means that it then can use force to make it happen. And that means the government gets to define what it is, and it gets to control us to achieve that. And so then part of it is the government gets to decide, well, does the right to healthcare include testing for this virus that's come over from China? And for a while they say, no, like all that means is the CDC gets to do it and nobody else gets to do it. And you see versus in a free country where everybody is free, like anyone is free to try to come up with tests, and then they can argue and say, hey, I've got the best test, I've got the best standard. So the only way that we come up with cures or tests or anything in the first place is individual human beings exercising their ingenuity. So it's especially crucial that we be free to create in this realm. And that includes, like, individuals can define it as different things, what it means. And I think it's true in education as well. I think it's terrible that the government gets to define what an education is, and then it gets to control all of us to pursue it. I mean, particularly with education, it's arguably even worse because the government gets to decide what nurtures a human mind. And I think almost everyone can agree that what governments have decided in general have done a very poor job. But I don't think people get the extent of it. They don't get the extent to which part of what governments do is they define education as something that supports the agendas of governments. And this is not a conspiracy theory. It's just the nature of the incentives involved. And with health, I would just observe that, this idea of a right to healthcare, what the government has done is it said, okay, we have a right to healthcare. That means we get to control you in the name of achieving healthcare. And right now it's saying you really have no rights at all because the healthcare system we've created, we don't believe has enough capacity to handle this disease. And so since our incompetent system can't handle this disease, then you get no freedom because you have a right to healthcare. So I think this should really reveal that when the government declares something a right and controls it, versus giving us the right to pursue it freely, it's a very destructive situation. It leads to a lack of innovation, but also like a very, very deadly and destructive lack of choice. And so right now we are experiencing the true meaning of the right to healthcare, which means bad decisions and really totalitarian control of our lives.
Yeah. I think some statists would say, well, if you give people freedom, you need to have a balance of some authoritarianism, because if you let people be free, they'll make mistakes. And it's like, well, first of all, you forget that government is made up of human beings. Those very same human beings who are open to making mistakes. The question is, does any human being have the right to violate the bodies and properties of other human beings? That's it. And if the answer is no, there's that ethical question. But the other piece is, if you let a group of people unilaterally declare that they own everyone in this, region, California, I don't know, United States, North Korea, then their decisions with their so-called property, other humans, and the land there could be disastrous, because now they're prescribing it and it's a one-size-fits-all. Whereas when you have freedom, you have decentralized impacts of failure. You don't have like a single point of failure. You have some people who will take a risk, spend 10 years saving money, and then they'll start a restaurant, and then all that money of 10 years is gone. But the difference is nobody else was forced to fund their 10 years of savings. They take the whole failure and the impact of the failure on themselves. So that's the other part of freedom that is actually more like practical, you could say, or whatever. So there's the ethics side of it, just whether or not you should be able to coerce somebody when you're a human being yourself. But the other piece is just recognizing the incentives that take place when you have freedom or not, and the disastrous greater effects that can happen when government does something wrong rather than an individual or like 20 people on their own property or something.
The issue of mistakes is an interesting issue, because you think about it, as an individual, what I care about with other people's mistakes, I don't fundamentally care that other people should make no mistakes. That's impossible anyway. But what I want is, I want to be
Right.
protected from people's mistakes, and that I do not want to be forced to comply with their mistakes. I'm willing to make my own mistakes, and I have to live with them, and I can grow. But if somebody else thinks, hey, Alex, it would be a great idea, this restaurant is a great idea, therefore you have to work here for 10 years, like, that's the kind of mistake I want to be insulated from. And so if you think you're rational, then it's not that. If you think you're rational, the solution is not try to prevent everyone from making mistakes or give yourself power to control everyone's lives, because you can't be rational with others' lives, because you can't determine their values or how to achieve them, for a whole bunch of reasons. But what you should want is, you should want the freedom to make your own choices and your own mistakes, but really be protected from other people's irrationality. And that's so. And again, I want to say that I do think that there's a role for a government to come in when there is like a universal threat to freedom. So this, again, like an invading attack or something like that. But it's anything the government does, the justification needs to be freedom, and it needs to give an explanation that is consistent with freedom. It definitely can't say, we're going to lock everyone down, we're not going to tell you how long, we don't really know how deadly this virus is. Like, we saw a model that someone from England made, even though they don't have any real data, and they're assuming that human beings are idiots if left free, and therefore, like, say goodbye to everything you've built. Like, that is not a freedom motivation. That is a we own your life motivation. We decide which lives matter, which means whose time matters.
Would you say that, given the government's actions right now, could you not, really qualify the government as a universal threat to freedom in terms of what the government actually is doing in the empirical reality? Is it not the entity that is a universal threat to freedom?
That's true.
Well,
that's a good point. Should there be a war?
This gets to broader issues, because, and I think we probably have some disagreement here, because this goes to, like, should there be any government? What's the, difference between, and that's probably outside the scope of what, we want to focus on. But I would say, so I think that there is a value to having a government, but I would say that the way the government is constituted and the way it's drifting, it is in many ways violating rights, and that should be fought. If you think of it as the government is your bodyguard, it's really supposed to be, everybody's bodyguard. And you wouldn't like it if, like, your bodyguard was telling you, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, oh, I'm going to take away your food, oh, I'm going to destroy your business. Like, he's like, I didn't hire you to do that, right? I hired you to protect me so I could pursue all these goals in a way that's peaceful and harmonious with others. And so if you really think about the government as your agent, it's your bodyguard, it really gives you and then you would also think, if it's your bodyguard, yeah, it shouldn't be taking other people's stuff. That doesn't make any sense for to say, oh, like, let's go loot that other person. No, it's protecting your body in an extended sense. It's protecting your life, which means it's protecting your freedom of action in a way that's consistent with other people's freedom of action. And one perspective,
I agree.
One perspective on this is that, this is just one aspect, but the government should be very transparent with information. I think that's a really important thing in this issue, particularly given that the government controls so much of medicine. We should really know, what's the state of hospital capacity, and what are the threats to different groups, and certainly, like, what's the plan, and what's going into it, what's happening with the testing. It's really important that the government is not, in the American conception, the government is not something above us. The government is our agent. It's our bodyguard. And if we thought of it that way, it would just, none of these things, many of these things would not make sense, and we could reorient it very differently.
Yeah, I think I mean I agree with you that if government is to exist, it should be nothing but a bodyguard, right? That is the original intention that people have, or more libertarian minarchists have, which is just okay. I want government, but I just want government to protect body and property rights. That's it. That's all it does. And so even they don't even advocate for taxation because taxation is done through coercive means. So they just advocate for government funded voluntarily. But I think the more than just seeing government as a bodyguard, I still think that to get closer to reality and take away as many abstractions as possible is just to see government as made up of human beings. And if you have for example, I liked your example of the bodyguard. If you have a bodyguard that's like, hey, I'm gonna, put this gun in your face every time you try to, I don't know, have a joint or something, and threaten you, and you say you're fired, and they're like, too bad. If you don't want to die, you better keep paying me as your bodyguard. That is more the relationship we have. It's these people who pretend to be our bodyguard, but they actually aren't. There are oppressors, and we need to reveal the wolf in sheep's clothing, or the wolf in, bodyguard clothing, because you're right. That is how government, especially the US government, presents itself. We are protecting you. We're locking you down. Don't worry, like Trump's speeches, we're going to keep you safe. We have a coronavirus task force. We're all, caring about you. We're going to print trillions of dollars because we care about you. It's going to be in your name. And we're going to spend 2 trillion, but only 30% is less is going to be sent to you, and that'll be who knows when the inflation catches up. And so that's what we have here today. And sure, you may have seen that I'm a voluntarist or an anarchist, but I would love a limited constitutional republic. I would love people to have this culture again, at the very least, that if government is to exist, all it does is defend liberty. And what is liberty? And for people to understand what actual liberty looks like. I really liked how you're saying the right to healthcare, the right to this. Well, if your so-called right to healthcare impedes on someone else's body and property rights, then it shouldn't be a right. It shouldn't be there because it's infringing on other people, other individuals.
Yeah, I think a point we definitely agree on is we want to get rid of being euphemistic with just about everything. I think we want to identify, and all of this stuff is existing in euphemisms. Like, we're saving lives, we're giving relief.
Yeah.
Like the government is an agency of force, and I believe such an agency should exist, but you need to recognize as what it's doing is it is compelling people. And if you really recognize that every time you think of government, you think this is wielding things that can make people do things against their will. If you keep that in mind, then
Right.
you'll be really circumscribing what it does, versus if you view it as, oh, it's a nice rich uncle who, whenever there's a problem, gives me a present, then you've just it's a total denial of the reality of what it is and what is actually happening.
That's a really good metaphor. I mean, you could take it a step further and just recognize that maybe it's an uncle that bribes you here and there, but he's molesting you.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Sorry,
Sorry,
the government just giving you the reach around.
I just like government.
Alex.
I really like government
Yeah.
metaphors related to like domestic violence, because I feel like it really like paints the picture really clearly. Because most people are against domestic abuse, so I like to just
yeah, but it's
And also for me, like where it becomes easier. I'm sorry.
no, you
The
go ahead.
lag.
sorry the lag.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say really quick.
Okay.
So where it becomes easier to see, I think, for a lot of people, and this is a really good case study, is with coronavirus and looking at the nature of governments, right? When we look at our, and I say our just in the generic sense, just the government that exists here close in proximity to us, and we compare that to other governments of the world, it becomes easy to see how you are more suspect of other regimes and other governments. You say, wow, that communist Chinese, they're just so bad. They're covering things up. They're like sealing people in their homes, and they're murdering people in the streets. And I've seen the actual videos. I have a client who's, from China, and they were showing me this way months before this became a big thing, of people getting locked up, actually sealed in their homes in Wuhan and getting shot in the street. So it's pretty gnarly what's out there, because, they're native and they speak Mandarin. They were showing me stuff. I was like, oh, okay, wow. So, it's very easy to see the brutish acts of other people and other dictators and their governments. But you come to your home government and you're like, well, they have my best interests in mind. They're just trying to protect the economy. But when you remove the abstractions and the idioms and the platitudes and the synecdoches, you really get down to, okay, these are people who are claiming to own us by unilateral decree. They say they own our bodies, they own our properties, and we have to pay them in perpetuity, or else they're going to throw us in a cage. And they're downplaying the spread, and then they're overplaying the risks, and they're using every possible mechanism you can imagine to keep people from coming up with solutions, from the FDA to the CDC to, intellectual property, and preventing people from coming up with ventilators, solutions, even though people were already copying, crowdsourcing and things like that. And it really starts to, percolate the idea that, wow, you can really see in a very short amount of time the manifestation of how government regulation crushes human flourishing in that most critical moment, and how in that one little bit of a few weeks, the government stopping the testing and stopping the solutions can cause far worse things you can possibly imagine. And then on top of that, they want to rationalize it with more oppression. So, I mean, I think strikes a chord with people what you say about human flourishing, because if you lose sight of that human flourishing, as I think it's very crucial. If you lose sight of that human flourishing aspect, then you lose sight of what's being lost, even when you think, well, they're my benevolent, hometown dictators. So, they're here to help me. When you lose sight of the flourishing, it becomes easy to rationalize that. And I think, what you were saying, it just really speaks to that well.
I mean, I think one thing with government is, like, it's important to describe what it's doing in a very precise versus a precise way versus a euphemistic way. So that's one thing. But it's also important that we choose it, or that at least most people endorse government the way it is. And part of correcting that is identifying what it is and getting rid of the euphemism. But part of it is it relates to your morality, including, do you view individual lives as what ultimately matters? Like, do you believe that an individual life is sacred? And I don't mean I'm not religious. I just mean, like, do you believe that that's an important thing, that an individual can think and act and build a life and pursue dreams and do that in harmony with other people? Is that something you regard as important? Or do you just think the individual just belongs to the masses? And if you really, I mean, you said earlier, like, you're an individualist. Yeah. Like, I think that's the only way to really value human beings, because human beings are individual. And I think that that's one thing to ask ourselves is, like, do individual lives matter? And if they do, then individual freedom matters, and the values they choose under freedom matter. And it should be really viewed as almost the worst possible thing if the government just puts a stop to their value pursuit for some amount of time, versus just, oh, that's fine, we're saving lives. Like, just, Bill Gates. I mean, Bill Gates put out a statement that really, I'm not a complete fan of his at all, but I admire certain things. But just saying about, he just said something about, like, oh, at least 10 weeks, nobody can do anything. And I'm just thinking, okay, how easy is that for you to say in your $200 million compound? I mean, just think about everyone I know. I mean, everybody I know is having their life upended by this. I mean, from poor people I know to millionaires. And it's just, oh yeah, just sit at home. And oh yeah, if you have an abusive spouse, just sit at home. It's like, they're not even looking for, they're not even looking for a more voluntary, rational approach. It's just like, oh yeah, let's lock everyone down, put families of all ages in the same place, like, no sharing childcare. There's not even a desire for a pro-flourishing solution. And that shows that there's something really off with the values. If you can just tell people, oh, for 10 weeks, stop your life, as if you can restart it afterward once you're drained of resources and you don't even know what anyone else wants anymore because they're drained of resources. Like, if you think that's not, if you can just say that as the first half of a sentence, you are not valuing human life in a meaningful sense. It's more of a like a detached collective sense. Like, oh, I want to save everyone's life. Why? So we can all be in a state of living death.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And
Right.
one thing I want to remind people that I had to be reminded of, like, someone made this sticker that was like, people forget that politicians are people too, with names and addresses. And well, what I liked about that is they're just trying to say, hey, just don't forget to, remember the reality here. Don't get carried away from just extracting and saying politicians. It's like, no, there's very specific people, Hillary Clinton, people who really don't share your values, as you're saying here. And whether you are advocating for US government to exist or whatever, all I'm saying is we just need to maximize uh, voluntary human interactions and individual property rights as much as possible. And whether a government exists is irrelevant, because it's, at the end of the day, those individual actions that people are calling for.
Right. It's really just a human psychology, right? The state doesn't exist. It's not like, oh, you go and, oh, here's the state. It's like, this matter, like it's carbon in the ground. It's literally just human beings. Like, we're all human beings, and whether there's a state or not is just a flip of the switch of human psychology. It's nothing more than like in the mind.
And so part of what we need to do is, whether or not you agree with government, whether or not you're an anarchist or you want a government, it doesn't matter. It's just, we all need to, liberty lovers, freedom lovers everywhere, peace lovers everywhere, should be very good at identifying who the true human enemies are, because they are human and they are individuals too. And they have their very clear, specific agendas and their own personal histories of their own, relationships in politics. And some are career politicians and have been doing those backdoor deals for a long time, like Joe Biden or, whoever. Like, and getting really clear about that and making sure to speak out against those people and expose them for who they are, and help to, and also, at the same time, you can generalize in that you're just clear about what government action is. That's not really a generalization. That's just saying, okay, the federal government, this is what, they're a monopoly on violence and force. That's the point. So
if people are interested in more of my view on this, you can check out Ayn Rand has an essay called The Nature of Government, which I'm sure is free online. It's also in her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And that's also a great book, because the first essay of it, I think, gives the truly individualistic she doesn't use the term flourishing, but pro-flourishing view of capitalism. Because I think capitalism, even many supporters, often advocate it as a collective thing. Like, well, we'll allow collectivism because it gives everyone a GDP, versus no, her view is capitalism is the system that emerges when individual rights are protected. And you can describe how through mass voluntary interaction, individuals on balance benefit hugely. But she still thinks of it in terms of, it's all about the individual. It's not about, oh, we tolerate, Steve Jobs because he benefits other people. It's no, Steve Jobs has a right to create value and enjoy his life. And part of the nature of human life is that we're creators. And so when we create value and exchange it, we benefit others. But it's this very pro-individual, pro-human view, versus if you really look at the collective view of, oh, capitalism is only good for the common good, then you really don't value any individual. And then it's not really valuing life. And it's not consistent with how we think of our own lives. Like, we have our own hopes and dreams and we build things. And then we talk about capitalism as, oh, we're the slave of the consumer. Like, I'm not the slave of a consumer. I'm a value creator. I'm a trader. And I want to live in a nation with 330 million other value creators and traders. And then that's capitalism. But it's not, oh, leave me free or leave Steve Jobs free because it serves everyone else who should get his stuff whether or not they deserve it. No, like, so the ultimate justification of freedom is because it liberates the individual to pursue their life as they choose in harmony with others.
Definitely. I just want to, that just reminds me of how it's another mindless model. The whole like, oh, the mindless consumer. That's why we can't have capitalism, unregulated capitalism, because there's mindless consumers and they'll be stupid and they'll just be swayed. When reality is there are different kinds of people, and some are really smart consumers. They do really detailed reviews and they help push the market of whatever product they're, reviewing or consuming, and really pushing it in a better direction, just from their feedback and by being a consumer. But they're
And
doing it in a way
why do
that's
they care?
intelligent and actually.
Why do they care? I don't understand when people say like, if somebody else is stupid, why is that your business? Like why? And you get to
Oh, that's
decide
that's another.
what's
Yeah,
stupid and what's not. So it's this idea that you own the person talking is a little Caesar who owns everyone
right,
else's life. And it's like, yeah, I care about them,
right.
but it's really closely related to, oh, I want to
You really don't.
control them versus I'm very much like, I don't think I own, like, I didn't need to interact with most people. Like, it's my job. I find people that I have common interests with, and I want to be free to trade with them. And in general, it's good that there are all these other creative people that we can benefit from in all sorts of different ways. But I don't believe that I own other people's lives or that their success or failure is my business. I mean, it's my job to create value and to interact with people when it makes sense. And I don't, if other people do really irrational things, then that's their right to do. But it's definitely also, it's our right to do what we think is right, including to do rational things that the government regards as irrational. And that's really, if you care about your life, you want to be protected from, again, the mistakes of others being forced on you. You don't really care fundamentally if other people make mistakes of their own. Like, that's part of life. But if other people can force their mistakes on you, that means your irreplaceable life, your irreplaceable time, like, some of that is destroyed. And I think that's what's happening now. Is I think literally years of people's lives will be much lower quality than they would have been had the government had a much more rational, uh, pro freedom policy here.
Yeah.
And I think actually what you just said, based on what you're talking about before, with this time difference between how people's times are being valued by government central planning, actually just brought up a kind of like one of those Freakonomics meta-analysis kind of things, where you could actually even weigh, in a real economic sense, how many people's lives are going to ultimately be shortened due to the government intervention, and add up those hours in terms of government shortening versus the lives saved supposedly by coronavirus. Because I think that's actually quite possibly a real outcome. And I say this because I did my doctoral thesis on the TSA, and I did in there I was doing analysis of comparison of how the number of lives lost on 9/11 actually is far less than the hours lost collectively of every year having to wait through the TSA. And people don't think about that your life is being drained away by the government having to do all these waits, for the TSA.
And that's your time.
And collectively, when you add up the hours, it adds up to an average, lifespan of 75 years and all these different, people over the years. So, more people's lives are being drained hours at a time by the government, in the name of preventing, this calamity. And I wonder to what extent we're going to see that same thing, or we're going to see people whose lives or lifespans are shortened because of the poverty. There's going to be increase in suicides. There's going to be increase potentially in other kinds of deaths because of displacement in the hospitals and because of lack of economic productivity. I think that's going to be a really fascinating and also tragic realization that might be too late for most people to come to realize, that there are going to be, in real human body lives and real time lost, people who suffer because of the government's intervention in the market in terms of banning businesses and banning economic activity and travel and trade.
Indirectly or directly, as has already happened ever since December, when it seems to have started really having been released. So
I mean, I think that's true. I actually think this is the TSA would be an interesting thing to discuss, because it's part of the question is, there's a whole question of to what extent is this policy necessary to prevent a lot more death? Whereas with the coronavirus, I think it's definitely going to be that you'll be able to say, oh yeah, many more lives were lost in an absolute sense. Like, there are more death hours created or less life hours lived based on the policies. I would bet a lot of money on that. But as I said before, I don't think in those terms. I don't think it's the right thing for the government to say, oh, my job is to create as many net life hours as possible. because it could do all sorts of
Oh,
crazy
of
things.
course.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
even right now, what you're seeing is
Yeah.
a very
What they're
significant
doing
decline
now.
in the death. You're seeing it like
Oh,
with coronavirus or COVID-19, you're seeing like record low death rates right now. I don't know if you guys have seen these stats because everyone is
Mhm.
inside. So they're not like,
Right.
they're not getting in a car crash. And I don't consider that a good thing because they're not allowed to live their lives. This goes to the issue of freedom
yeah.
and quality of life, where it's not the thing. If we're weighing anything, it should ultimately be like people's ability to like make the most out of their lives, to live fulfilling lives, to live flourishing lives, not just to be like alive in some sort of barely alive sense of, oh, like I'm going to be in the ICU a little bit longer. And that's where what you're noticing in the way this collectivism works is nobody is counting all the people whose lives are being made miserable. That doesn't factor on anyone's scale. Like, and that's crazy. Like if you
Right.
have a standard
Except for yours.
yeah, for me, but if we're like 100 million people or 200 million people being made far more miserable for an extended period of time, like if that doesn't matter to you, then you don't care about human life. Because why are you extending human life? Then you're just extending misery. That's why, Ayn Rand had this expression, living death, to talk about, like, some people who say they're for life. They're for, like, if you're not for life in the sense of flourishing, it just means I just want to extend life or preserve life in a miserable state. And that's not my view of being for human life.
Yeah. It sounds like you don't think the ends, the outcomes justify the violent means. Like you don't think violence and violating individual rights is ever necessary. Well, except for your exception, as you said, of if it's defending freedom, which we could have a whole other conversation about. But in general, that's your focus is you want to maximize human flourishing and freedom and liberty. Like, and you don't want to cover up that fact when governments are violating it. And you don't, as much as possible, don't want government to violate individuals. So,
Well, I would put it differently. I mean, I would say the moral end is individuals flourishing. The political means is freedom. And therefore the government's end should be freedom. There's no such thing as a means for the government, a proper means for the government that doesn't involve protecting freedom. As I said, it has a coercive power, which I think is necessary to protect freedom, and certainly in certain situations is. But the government's goal should be protect freedom, period. It should not be like help Alex live a good life. Like, I don't need guns for that. I don't need somebody else's guns to tell me how to live. Like, I don't need that at all. I need the opposite of that. But I do need freedom. I need to be able to take action and to know that I'll be free to act, and I'll be free to benefit from the consequences of my action. Like, I'll be free to acquire property and to use it, and it's just like the person building the restaurant. Like, they were free to create it, they were free to own it, but now they're not free to use it, and they're not free to interact with others. And again, if you can prove that, well, in some temporary way, and it's going to end here, and this is why. But if you're just saying, oh yeah, you no longer have the right to the property you created, then you're not viewing it as your goal is to protect freedom. And it's such an unusual view today that the job of the government is to protect freedom. But I think that's the only moral view. And without that view, you get into just all of this sacrifice that everyone is advocating, just sacrificing some people's time and lives to others. And then the perverse form of that, where the young and healthy are particularly viewed as worthless in the calculation.
yeah, they're trying to apply like an objective metric to human lives and the value of a human life. And you can't. Value is subjective. That's why we advocate for individuals to be free and to subjectively value whatever they want to trade and get in whatever quantity. So I think that's part of it is they just forget the human, in that you can't say what someone's life is worth because only that person will have their own view of what their life is worth. So yeah.
And what risks are worth taking.
Right. Exactly, to them. And if they made their choice and they take that risk and they fail, they're more incentivized to learn from it if they were the ones who had the full freedom to make that choice. Versus if they know someone else forced them to make that choice, they're going to be pretty mad at that person. And that's what the government's doing now. They're forcing everyone to stay inside.
Well, like what you're saying ties to his discussion on education. And I think that's actually a root issue there, is that the public schooling system effectively shifts psychologically. It begins that process of disrupting incentives by getting young people to live in a truly socialistic atmosphere where their daily lives are planned hour by hour by state bureaucrats to a state curriculum. And they shift their psychology to become, casting off of their responsibility as I just have to follow orders, right? They just are supposed to obey authority, obey the teachers. The teachers say, well, I'm not in charge of the system. I'm just, I'm stuck in the system. So I got to do what I got to do.
Teachers tell you what you need to learn and what you should learn and what is the truth, and discourage you to read materials that's not in the scientific journals that they say are fine or whatever.
So essentially makes it so that young people are growing up with a psychology of, well, I'm not really responsible for myself and my actions. I was just stuck in this situation because that's all they know from kindergarten or first grade. They say I was just here and just following along with the system. So it really erodes the individual incentive and initiative, because they take on this mindset that they just have to follow the predetermined path of what was given to them, and that they have no meaningful choice in the matter, thanks to government laws, with truancy law and compulsory schooling laws. They think, well, it's just what it is. I just got to stick with it. And it's the true, in my opinion, crippling of the human spirit, ingenuity, creativity, because it takes young people's individual unique talents and abilities and puts them into a one-size-fits-all regimen of policy, where ultimately when they come out, they really don't have any semblance of self or self-worth.
I think Jack is speaking to where the mindless model, the view of human beings as being mindless, comes from. It's mostly government indoctrination and propaganda.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about education in terms of, because there's an issue of just what's the right form of education absent government, and then how government affects education and why it shouldn't be involved. There's that book I mentioned in Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, has a good chapter about education. I forget exactly what it's called. But then also there's an essay by Ayn Rand. I think it's in The Voice of Reason, and you guys might be interested. It's called The Establishing of an Establishment. It might be in Philosophy Who Needs It, but if you look up The Establishing of an Establishment, and what it's really about is why the government involvement in the realm of ideas is so toxic, why that's the last realm where you want force determining which ideas are valid and which ideas are invalid. You just institutionalize and you create a monopoly for bad ideas. And just as if you create a government monopoly on bricks or something like that, that's going to ruin innovation in bricks. And it's going to, if you're doing it with the mind, that's the worst. That's the worst thing that you could monopolize. Yeah. And it's such a lever, like a corrupt lever for, to give people control of the minds. Wow. Of everyone. And so I'd just recommend anyone who's listening. I mean, I hope I should advertise, I guess, if you're interested in my stuff, you should go to industrialprogress.com and sign up for our newsletter. But if you are an Alex Epstein on Twitter, but if you're interested more broadly in freedom, I'd highly recommend reading Ayn Rand. And there's an Ayn Rand Institute at AYNRAND.org. And you can learn more about those ideas, because I think she's really, I really regard her as having developed the science of liberty, including the individual morality that really that's the justification of liberty, and that makes liberty as, we want bodyguards to allow individuals to live their life. We need a government rather as the bodyguard for individuals to live their lives as their mind judges best.
And just piggybacking real quick off of what you just said about, education system and crushing the individual mind, and where you don't really want that big underpinning unstated assumption. And I know how much you love philosophy and, checking your assumptions, right, is the idea that central planners have the knowledge to know what all children should know for their lives. That is the underpinning, unstated assumption of compulsory public school, is that the central planners know what all children must know based on their age, based on their grades, based on, whatever circumstances are. And we're seeing that now too, even with coronavirus, right? They're starting to say, oh, well, I guess we need to do virtual school. Oh, charter schools, you can't do this and you can't do this. And they're still continuing to try to manifest this control over young people's minds, even in the supposed chaos that they have to, say who can do what and who can teach what and who has to be where for all these school shutdowns. So I think what you said is very powerful to really contemplate and think about just how corrosive that central planning can be on the mind, and how you don't want to intermingle that central planning within, young people, especially who are developing their formative, unique identities and individual thoughts and passions, and pursuits.
I think it's intentional. There's a reason all governments have a schooling system. But Alex, I know you have to, you want to have certain time. So I'd like you to, close out with whatever thoughts you have, and feel free to share again for anyone who may not have heard where they can follow your stuff and find your content.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of really good issues. I'm trying to think of anything specific I want to say. I guess just that if we didn't talk about energy, which is kind of the subject I'm known for. So I have a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and my broad perspective is that when we're evaluating different kinds of really important, controversial, confusing issues, we should really be thinking of them in terms of what's going to advance human flourishing. And the reason that I got really involved in this coronavirus issue is because I was seeing analyses of the issue that did not value human flourishing, and very related, did not value human freedom. And what I've seen in my work on energy and environmental issues is there's a history of people claiming that leaving people free will cause a catastrophe. Therefore, we need to radically restrict their freedom. And I've seen that pattern where people make catastrophe predictions that turn out to be wildly exaggerated or even just completely false. And their solution is always, let's radically restrict individual freedom, with no concern at all about what that means for human flourishing. And what I saw here is something that I do regard as a real concern. But there's this catastrophizing element of millions of people are going to die unless the government cracks down. We're all just going to do these stupid things, and with no regard for what that means for the lives and flourishing of the people who are coerced. And I saw that pattern, and I see it in, a country that has many problems, but it's still in many ways the freest country on earth. And I'm seeing this is a moment in time where people are using this to justify what I regard as catastrophic restrictions on freedom. So I think it's important to identify freedom is not the cause of this problem. Freedom is the solution to this problem. And largely the cause of this problem is lack of freedom, including lack of freedom to innovate in the medical realm. And then all the economic problems are being caused by lack of freedom to act in the interpersonal realm. So this is why it matters so much to me. And if people are interested, again, our website is industrialprogress.com. If you get on that mailing list, that's what I would recommend. If you go to the mailing list there, then you can get my weekly email, and then you'll see I have a couple podcasts like Human Flourishing Project, and one called Power Hour that's primarily on energy issues. And if you're interested in this kind of perspective, I record those, one of them weekly, one of them biweekly. And I think that I'm hoping to bring more people to this pro-flourishing, pro-freedom approach. So I appreciate you guys having me on and raising these issues. And it was really nice to meet you.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you too. And great ending thoughts. I guess we will close on that, and thank Alex for his time. Definitely check it out. We put it on the screen, industrialprogress.com, and follow Alex Epstein on Twitter.
Great Twitter.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great Twitter.
The best Twitter. Huge.
If I can just make a fan request as a fan, if Alex Epstein did like a philosophy podcast where he just talks about anything, not just energy, not just Corona, anything, just from his philosopher bent, I would totally listen. But anyway,
there is that podcast. There is that podcast. It's the Human Flourishing Project. Have you heard that
Oh,
podcast?
well, okay, right? No, I don't know. I only heard Industrial Park. Okay, I gotta go there.
Now you
Yeah,
know
that's
where to
it.
go.
That's
And
it.
so does
If you're
everybody
on
else
the
too.
mailing list, that's at humanflourishingproject.com. I mean, it's mostly about issues of individual flourishing, but there's a bunch of epistemology and I mean, some ethics and a lot of stuff on persuasion. So, well, you got your wish, and there are like 60 episodes. So you got something to do while locked
Okay, cool.
indoors.
It's exactly. Now everybody
More
can
things
can
to
binge
listen
listen.
to. Yeah, we'll all be like philosophers when we come out. Like,
Yeah.
even more.
Well,
All right, thank you so much, Alex.
All right, good
Thanks,
night,
Alex.
guys.
All right,
Thank
take
you
care,
so much,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks.
Stay